Hi, and welcome to Contercast. My name's Kat Boyd, and I'm joined as ever with my lovely co-host, David Jameson.
How's it going? I need to start having something better to say at this point.
I am absolutely sick of my own intro line.
Yeah.
How's
it going?
How's it going? Every single time. Yeah, we need to work on that. There's plenty of room for improvement on this pod, always. We are joined tonight with another very special guest. We have Kevin McKenna on the pod. Hi, Kevin.
Hiya. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Kevin's a journalist, and we were debating about whether to introduce Kevin as a political commentator, as seems to be the fashionable trend at the moment. Everyone seems to be a political commentator. David, even when you were on Russia Today, I think you got introduced as a political commentator, right?
A rung lower, political analyst, which is the lowliest job, on Russia Today, everyone's a political analyst. It usually means crazy person with a blog.
But that's what I was going to say. In order to be a real political analyst, you have to have a blog. You
have to be a real crank, yeah. Political analyst, it's like a bullet to the heart, that one should describe as a political analyst.
Political analysts always throws up images of people who work on presidential campaigns, re-election campaigns.
It's very American.
Yeah.
I mean, don't get me started on Americanisms in Scotland. We had a whole episode about how much we hate the intrusion of American political culture into Scotland. It's one of my pet hates.
You don't usually think of Russia Today as a great carrier of Americanisms, but it actually is. It's a very kind of like Fox News type show when you watch it.
I mean, we don't really have a Scottish equivalent of Fox News, do we?
The New Times, Sunday Times, digital channel.
Yes, this is what's his name, Andrew Neil, is setting up a new, because he got booted out of the BBC.
Yeah,
I don't really know what happened there, but he's obviously setting up this American style adversarial, TV, kind of cable TV type format, because traditionally in America, it's not the newspapers that are hyper-partisan, it's the TV channels that are hyper-partisan. And he used to be a great critic of that model until someone presumably gave him quite a lot of money to head up a new kind of Fox News type right-wing cable program. He also set up Sky News, so he sort of knows what he's doing. So
I think he'll make a good job of it, actually.
I think he's got a vendetta. Like he wants revenge in the BBC, which usually drives him. So like, I'll maybe try and become a political analyst on that.
It makes me think of the Berlusconi model of politics, because that's what he did, right? He was a cable TV guy. Do you know what I mean? And that's where he really exposed himself to the population. Why did I use that phrase? As the words were coming out of my mouth, I was like, "Cat, dial it back."
Bunga Live and so on.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, it was
Boris Johnson's been a couple of those parties, was he not?
Has he actually been at a couple of parties?
That might be actionable, Cat. That might be your first.
Let's it out, right? I mean, he does seem the type. That's probably actionable as well, right? Scrap it. But Kevin, you wrote an article today for your column in The National, in which I suppose The National is a bit like in that sort of propagandist media wing, isn't it?
Oh,
you probably can't see.
Well, it's interesting because I remember on the day that it launched, 2015, I think, or the evening that it launched, STV did an extended sort of slot on their nighttime news program for were political analysts and commentators like me. And there were 2 or 3 other journalists, and we were all being asked about what we thought of it. Was there room in the market for it? Could it possibly survive, given that, you know, because of the falling circulations of newspapers, and also the very valid question about bias. You know, could it possibly get away with being nakedly and unashamedly pro-independence? My point was that it's important to separate being pro-independence from pro-SNP. And the newspapers, you know, the National's bias in favour of independence was no greater than the Daily Mail's bias towards the Union. Right-wing politics, and during Brexit, it probably wasn't any greater than the bias towards leaving Europe by more than half of the English newspaper titles. And I find, quite often I find myself arguing with people who talk about the press in very lofty terms, and they put it on a pedestal, and they talk about the press, you know, basically brandishing the sword of truth at the coalface of truth, exposing lies and being balanced and fair. And the press in the UK has never been balanced, and it's never been fair, because the pattern of ownership of the press it basically resides in no more than half a dozen very rich, very white old men, usually from Britain, occasionally from overseas, and that's been the case for hundreds of years. And in Scotland, it's probably, you know, the attempt at balance and the attempt at being fair is probably more pronounced in Scotland than it is in England, where I think, with the possible exception of the Guardian and obviously the Mirror, all of the great newspapers, the oldest newspapers, they've never even pretended to be balanced. I think there's obviously an onus to try and be accurate. So even if you're shafting your opponents, get the facts right, you know, criticise them on that. But this concept of the British press and the Scottish press being required to be balanced and fair and reasonable it never existed. And I suppose the alternative is, well, you know, do you have state-run newspapers that require to be balanced? But if you have state-run newspapers, what's the point? What's the point in having a state-run newspaper? Because anything you say about the government of the day, and we're seeing this in various debates about the BBC, are just going to be worthless, I suppose. So whether you like it or not, the press is biased, it's not balanced, it doesn't have to be, and as long as you know that the political proclivities of the paper that you're buying, then you use your skill, judgment, discrimination, instincts to separate or to bear these things in mind when you're reading what they're telling you.
I think that this is why the debate about the BBC within the pro-independence movement, I think, has to be, like, I approach it with a degree of caution, because the toxic bias of privately owned media is, like, it obviously does have a huge impact on people's political consciousness, but at least I have a degree of autonomy in choosing whether or not to buy The Sun, say. But we do expect a degree of impartiality, whether rightly or wrongly, from a state-funded broadcaster. And I remember, like, round about 2015, 2016, I think Alex Salmond actually said quite directly that he thought the BBC was partly to blame for the the loss of the referendum. And I just think that there's a little bit of danger that in a rush, like the kind of pro-independence rush to condemn the BBC, is that we forget how grotesque private media can be. And you're right, it's not balanced. Like, I remember writing something a few years ago about the likelihood, or the ratio rather, of heads of industry, the CBI, private financial interests, private capital interests being interviewed on The Economy compared to how often trade union leaders would be interviewed or asked to comment on serious economic matters. And I think it's huge. You know, I think it's like 26, 27 times more likely that you will hear from a business leader, which is kind of one of those phrases that should go in the bin along with the political analyst. Like, you don't get, you know, trade union leaders. We don't have industrial correspondents anymore. But people, I think, expect more from something like the BBC.
But then you look at if you look at the annual surveys run by, like, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, various other kind of leftish think tanks, when they come up with sets of indicators to measure social progress, I think, is that the phrase that they use? And they look at the backgrounds and the education of people in key industries and key positions in the private sector and the public sector, and you know, the BBC, as well as all of our political parties by degrees, the BBC executives are dominated by people who went to private schools and thereafter to Oxford or Cambridge, and this, you know, that this is true also of the researchers, the producers, the people that you don't see in front of camera. And so when they're asked to get 3 or 4 talking heads to front up a program, they go to their own kind. They go to the people that they know, the ones whose numbers are in their phone book, and quite often it's an unconscious bias, because you know, fast news is breaking. You've got half an hour to put together a program, right? Tristram, we need 3 people. You've got half an hour to bring 3 people. What's he going to do? He's just going to go to his iPhone and all the numbers there, and then it'll be all Tristram's pals from Oxford and Cambridge, you know, who are now running kind of .com companies and sitting in the boards of banks. And it's just that inbuilt, quite often unconscious, but it's still there, bias. And I agree with you about the, you know, union leaders and business leaders. There's almost this assumption that a business leader knows what he's talking about because he's running a business. And I'm thinking, yeah, but the union leader knows what he's talking about because he's representing the people who actually help this guy make his money, and is probably more aware of relationships on shop floor, how the money is made, the machinery, the margins, than the so-called business leader stroke entrepreneur. Anyway, I just had to get off my chest.
No, I mean, feel free to rant. This is the vibe of the podcast, of course. Do you know, I was just thinking there about one of my favourite moments on, I think it was BBC News, and like maybe both of you do or don't remember this, I'm not sure, but it was in the 2000s when there was a particular strong and sustained assault from Israel on Palestine, and there was the huge appeal for aid to Gaza. And Tony Benn was on the BBC, and he had been told explicitly, do not mention the charitable donation line, because we can't guarantee that money isn't going to naughty terrorists. And I remember Tony Benn just being like, no, I'm going to read it. This is the number. Right. If you phone this number, you can donate. And there was just this like real sense of there was no deference to the BBC or to the media. And I think that that's what we lack now, is we do actually have a lack of political commentators. So, do you know what I mean? Politicians, political commentators, political analysts, or whatever, who are able to and willing to really like stand up to the almost the stitch up of the establishment in somewhere small like Scotland, where there is a strong relationship and maybe like a growing relationship between the media and our own government in Holyrood. And I guess that's the kind of one of the points in your article, isn't it?
Yeah, that was probably the whole that was probably the main thrust of your question, which I avoided answering and went on a rant in lots of different directions. So I was, the article was occasioned by the news that Richard Walker, who was the founding editor of The National and a very experienced journalist of about 40 years, who's worked for most of the main titles in Scotland, is throwing his hat into the ring for the SNP, seeking the nomination in Ayr to take on John Scott, who's the Tory John Scott, sitting MSP. And I thought, bang, there goes another one. Richard's a very talented journalist. He's currently editing the Sunday National, and if he wins, that's another talented, experienced journalist who has who has asked questions of the SNP, even though he's obviously very pro-independence, and also over the last couple of years there have been some very experienced, very good journalists on the Herald, just to quote one paper, who are now sitting in government. Now, these journalists had the experience and the know-how in subjects such as health and education to drill into government statements, press releases, and to basically guide the reader through them and expose maybe some of the inconsistencies and to shine a light into some of the important details that get buried in 5,000-word policy statements. That's their job. That's what they're good at. They're all now working for the government, holding bags for some minister, crunching numbers, and so just bit by bit. And part of it's due to falling circulation, part of it is due to the changing models of newspapers, and part of it is the challenge and the rise of podcasts such as this and blogs, where people have got far more choice in how they obtain their news, how they consume news and comment. But somebody at the SNP obviously is doing their job right and has seen this coming a few years ago and thought, we can actually exploit this and offer jobs, safe jobs, well pensioned, to people who were in newspapers, and bit by bit the media becomes less able to, or has fewer resources to scrutinise the government. And the government in Scotland needs scrutinised, not least for the fact that by the time the SNP are voted out of Scotland, whether that's as part of the UK, whether it's as an independent Scotland, around about 25 years will have elapsed. I mean, the SNP are on course, if they aren't already, the longest serving government in Western Europe. So, and even if you're an SNP supporter, pro-independence, it becomes ever more important to scrutinise what that eternal party of government is doing. And unfortunately, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party of Holyrood seem incapable of landing a glove on the SNP. And that's, when that happens, when you weak political oppositions, traditionally the press is supposed to, or ought to be, standing in the gap and scrutinising, and it's not happening to the extent that it ought to be because of this brain drain, this migration of talented, experienced journalists into government, or worse, into assorted lobbying firms who have their connections and whose networks include the government. But that's an entirely different programme in its own. I'm not going to bore you.
I think this is a really Oh, I think this is a really interesting. Have I got a wee bit of reverb at your end, Kevin? No, it's fine. I think this is a really interesting subject because everyone knows that the media, the traditional media, the legacy media, whatever you want to call it, is in having this industrial decline, massive industrial decline, that's threatening some of the oldest newspaper titles in the world, including some in Scotland, where the media environment is already pretty weak. The newspaper environment is already pretty weak. I mean, when I was growing up, we always got the Herald. And I remember when I was sort of disgusted to learn that it's not even a national newspaper. It's a Glasgow newspaper. Do you know, in Ayr, your family getting a newspaper, which is a local paper to bring you the national news. So it's always had those structural weaknesses, at least in recent decades, but it's totally falling apart under the pressure that's on the global industry. But there is an interesting question about where those people go. Where does the labour component go when the capital's dried up? And the evidence from around the world, in the Western world anyway, is that they go into PR. So in the United States, I think it's been something like 10 years since the number of professional lobbyists and PR workers outgrew the number of existing journalists. So you had a situation where there were more people spinning the news than writing the news, more people trying to deflect investigations than conduct investigations, which is obviously a moment in civil society and democracy and so on. There's a really interesting moment, I think, for this in Scotland, which is Murray Foot. Murray Foot, of course, was the author of the infamous Vow. He is now working at SNP, HQ, as one of their senior communications people. Now, what I'm about to say is pure speculation. This is the sort of quality you get from a political analyst rather than a journalist, right? But I remember a lot of people saying of Murray Foot, well, this is it. He's being brought in for independence. He's being brought in because he understands the way the country thinks. That's how he was the genius who came up with the Vow, because there's this whole mythology that the Vow denied us independence, right? It didn't. It was just another stunt in a long campaign. It didn't lose us the referendum, the independence side. Anyway, this maverick genius got in from the cold, and he is going to create this new independence strategy that appeals to the broadest swathes of the country. I always suspected, and I have no reason not to think this, that he was actually brought in to deal with the fallout from the Alex Salmond affair. So, you've got this situation where the mythology of the kind of journalistic caste is being used to cover for the fact that really this is about obscuring the murky business of government, and it's always pretty murky. There are always secrets in powerful places. And that's what a lot of, as you say, very trained over decades, very well networked media workers, that's the kind of thing they're going into. They're not just trying to promote the public image of a political party or an administration and its policies and all this kind of stuff. They're also being brought in to keep secrets.
Yeah, I would say that's a reasonable analysis, and I would also say that your suspicions or your instincts as to the real reasons Murray Foot was brought in are spot on, bang on the money. People forget that the Vow, the legendary Vow, wasn't worth the price of the cigarette packet on the back of which it was written. It fell apart. It just reading. The genius actually of the Vow was nothing to do with the words, how it came about, but it was a damn good front page. It was a good design, and it was well timed. But the Vow itself was just mince, nonsense. And it's interesting you were talking about, I saw that survey of the quotient of PR, spin doctors, call them what you will, to proper journalists in America, and we're kind of approaching and may already have passed that moment in Scotland, and Richard's nomination for the SNP seemed to be emblematic of that. I think that that there is a changing models of press. Some papers will survive, some won't, and people are going elsewhere to consume news, especially venues or locations that are free. There's a danger with that though, because you get a kind of, there's a kind of Wild West aspect to this. There's some very good bloggers and responsible, and you can trust them, and they're well researched, and there are others that aren't. And when a blogger blogs something or retweets it and sticks it on Facebook, it begins a kind of it begins a momentum of its own, and in that momentum it almost confers its own truth, its own validity, and people get caught up in it. That's a blog, that guy looks as if he knows what he's talking about. He's put it out on Twitter and it's got several hundred responses, and it's on Facebook, but it hasn't been legaled. It doesn't have more than one source, if it even has one source for some of the facts, some of the numbers it's coming up with, and there's a chance it might even be defamatory. But if you're a major political presence, or you're an A-list or a B-list, so you're not going to come after a blogger for defamation. But it's still a challenge to newspapers to be creative, to be nimble, and we're far less able to do that when we lose creative talent to safe jobs in government, or safe jobs working for Charlotte Street Partners, for instance, or the other lobbying firms who kind of gather around Charlotte Street or around Holyrood. That's become one of the very few growth industries in 20 years of devolution. The rise of the rise of the workers in the Matalan suits and the little rucksacks that they wear, and their increasingly large smartphones, and they always seem to be scurrying here and there, and they've got a sort of kind of haircut. A lot of them have been watching too many American political movies, and there's an air of them doing something. They're either going somewhere or they're leaving. You never see them kind of just standing about reading a newspaper, having a chat. It's phone, going somewhere, and it's right, hand signals, 2 minutes, see you soon, give us a bell. You could do an entire sitcom. You go to the SNP conference and you see these people, and it's dismal. I mean, it's a subspecies, but it comes with good money, and we're paying them 40, 50, 60 grand basically to carry some minister's bag and come up with some numbers. That's one of the few growth industries, and the SNP are good at it. They are, and Labour aren't. Labour just, missed the boat in it, and they're not getting, also being in government is seductive. You want a career, you're going to gravitate towards not just the party in government, but the party that looks it's going to be in government and make a difference. Who wants to join the Labour Party? Who wants to join the Tories if you want a career in politics? Interestingly, you get, Kezia Dugdale, who became leader of the Labour Party, she started off her career looking for a job in the back office of the SNP. Kezia wanted into politics. Where does she want? What's the best place to start? We'll start with the SNP. They're going places. They're dynamic and they crunch numbers, and they've imported fancy digital election examination machines well before Labour did. This is a dynamic party, and she gets the training, she gets the background, she gets the connections, goes into the Labour Party. In a few years she's the leader of the Labour Party. Nobody wants to start off at the Labour Party at the moment, because that's where ideas, creativity goes to die. It's a graveyard for anything approaching creativity, thinking outside the box. It's right, how do we get our old places in Lanarkshire and Glasgow back, and how many ways can we keep saying there will be no second referendum? That's the Labour Party in Scotland summed up. useless party.
I think that the Labour Party's press output over the last few weeks has just been multiple press releases about Margaret Ferrier. Like that's it. About anyone who's on those distribution lists is basically like, this is actually becoming a bit like almost psychosexual now. Like every single press release is about like how Margaret Ferrier must go, and that's it. Like that's all. That's
There's a whole quantum of people out there that think Margaret Ferrier runs the country.
I know.
The Labour Party's so obsessed with her. I mean, who's this Margaret Ferrier? She must be really important.
Yeah, I kind of find the Margaret Ferrier thing like slightly hilarious. Like the whole. To be honest, I found almost every incident of people breaking the lockdown, the kind of high profile ones, is slightly hilarious. But I also feel like I when I see the amount of, so for example, Hamza Yusuf tweeted her and said, "We've been friends for many years. However, you have..."
That's sinister. That's sinister.
Because the most sinister thing is, what if that's true? The last time I was so disgusted by someone's Twitter activity was Kezia Dugdale's dad attacking her.
Yeah.
All right, that was sick.
It's sick, wasn't it? Even if all right, Kezia Dugdale, let's say she's a grifter. You know, as you say, she started off and she just wanted a career. She started off in the SNP, graduated into the Labour and became leader a few years later, right? It's totally cynical, right? But still, if I'd like to think if I was the dad of a really cynical careerist kid, regardless of what I thought, I would just be supporting them to the hilt. I just thought that was a wonderful person.
I sympathised with her.
Yeah, I was disgusted. I was sort of like, you know, I do think there's a kind of blood thicker than water thing there. I would keep my disgust inside and outwardly pretend that it was the most noble endeavour in the world.
I mean, it's not as if she was joining the Tories or you know, joining up with Nigel Farage, you know. Yeah.
I just thought it was such a shame that her dad had become kind of like this kind of cybernet icon for ruining his daughter's life.
I know.
It was awful.
It was totally sick. I think as a general principle, people's parents and children should be kept out of politics. Like, I think it's manky. Like, I'm not even in favor of the stuff around like schooling, right? And obviously I have a really strong view about private education, but I really don't think that we should be judging political actors, political leaders on what they do with their families or what their parents do. Do you know what I mean? I think that just on a moral level, that actually we should keep that out. I just think it's really manky politics.
Yeah, most of the time. But then if you're a Labour Party politician earning quite a lot of money with a really good career and you're manning the barricades against privilege, injustice, inequality, and it turns out your 4 kids, you're spending 50 grand a year sending your 4 kids to, you know, St Matilda's finishing school in Oxfordshire. Yeah, well, if your kids then get into the front line of fire, then it's not the press's fault. That's your dad's fault for being a raging hypocrite.
Yeah,
by and large, I accept the point. Yeah,
like I can see what you're saying, but whether an MP and Labour MPs feel like the most appropriate example here, but if a Labour MP is sending their kids to private school at the same time as they're railing against it, whether or not they send their 4 kids to private school matters jack shit in the grand scheme of the whole system around being able to buy your children privilege. Like, I think that the way that the discussion around like hypocrisy on the left tends to go, and particularly in the media, has become really warped, because really what we're talking about is families who can buy their children privilege to such an extent that they will essentially govern the country in 20 years' time. People who inherit wealth through their family, like more money than you could ever spend realistically in an entire lifetime. Not, do you know what I mean? You're like poor little brats going to a fancy school. Like, I'm not saying it's a good idea, nor am I defending it. I feel really squeamish about the whole the arguments around hypocrisy, because I think its ultimate conclusion ends in the Jeremy Corbyn lives in a big house type of argument, and I just like
I take your point. I take your point. Kinda. Because half of me's saying, you know, I'm a news editor. It's half an hour before the deadline. There's tumbleweed going through my news list, and in comes, you know, Henry Trumpington Smythe representing Newcastle, who's been flagging off the perfidious stories, and his 4 kids are going to a private school. I'm thinking, yeah, okay, we shouldn't bring the kids into it, but I've got a big hole where a story should be on page 5, and the deadline's half an hour away. That makes me a cynic. I know.
No, that's just the reality, I guess.
Kat, how many times have you been told that you living in the West End of Glasgow makes you
don't even fucking start me, right? Don't even fucking start me. Kat Boyd's leafy West End mansion.
Do you live in the West End of Glasgow?
Bought with her grand's inheritance. Blah blah blah.
That is a West End poster behind you.
This is the it's the Federation of Cuban Women.
Yeah, West End. You wouldn't get that in the Northeast. You wouldn't get that in the Northeast. Yeah, Saracen Street in Postle Park. What have you got in your wall? We talk of little else.
That's pure cheek.
That is not right. I know. Sorry.
But I will indulge it this once. Anyway, there's something that you said in your article today that that I thought was really insightful. So we've been talking about how, you know, if you want to get ahead, then, you know, you're going to go to the party that's most likely to be in power. But actually in Scotland, it's something a little bit more specific than this, because it's not just about cozying up to the SNP or getting a job with the SNP or dealing with the SNP as a party. It's a particular faction within the SNP. It's the Sturgeon Morel project.
Oh God, I knew I was going to regret writing that.
Oh, Kevin, please don't. It's a cracker of a line. So preferment in the current party owes more to your personal fealty to the Sturgeon Morel project than to any discernible talent or authentic commitment to an independent Scotland. It explains the presence of some outright roasters on the list of candidates. What a line.
I don't think I'd had my sugar intake yesterday when I wrote that. I was feeling a bit edgy and obstreperous. Right, okay. So there's a bit of poetic license in there, I freely admit. And I'm not rowing back from it. Look, if you're looking at Richard Walker and Murray Foot, right, there's an example. Richard Walker founded the National in 2015. Against all expectations and predictions, it did well. And he was producing papers with like literally a handful of staff, and you know, over a few years it actually began to gain sales when newspapers with 10 times as many journalists were losing them. So he did really well. He was also he'd also been, for a while, he was joint editing that with the Sunday Herald, which is now sadly no longer with us. And so he stepped back from the National just for a break, and then came back to edit the new Sunday National. But there was a time when I thought there was an opportunity for the SNP to hire Richard as Director of Communications or Head of Press, whatever it is. I mean, there's dozens of these people, right? There must be an entire Edinburgh office block full of press advisors that belong to the SNP or the Scottish Government, because the lines, you know, are so blurred now. But Richard, being, you know, a heartfelt nationalist, supporter of the SNP, producing a paper from nothing, making it fly with a handful of staff, and having been one of the best connected journalists, as well as being a very good journalist over many, many years, he should have walked into the SNP. You know, they should have been crawling over broken glass, say, Richard, we'll just create a job for you because we need somebody like you in here. And it didn't, the call didn't come. And now Richard's standing, you know, to become an MSP. Meanwhile, Murray Foote gets the call to do that job. Murray Foote, who, you know, whose editorship of the Record, but Murray Foote basically put the Daily Record in the front line of the Better Together campaign. Murray Foote is a very good journalist as well, but there are questions to be asked if you're within the SNP. Why not Richard Walker a couple of years ago, and why Murray Foote? And Richard, and I don't know if this is true or not, but there's a perception that Richard is quite close to Alex Salmond, because it was Alex Salmond who approached Richard and the Herald Group with the idea of publishing a daily pro-independence newspaper, and that this could fly because of the 45% who voted for independence, and also the fact that as the 2015 election showed, the 45% weren't going away, and it was, you know, it was massive, record numbers of people wanting to be members of the SNP. So it made sense. It was a bit, you know, it made business sense. If you publish a newspaper, to take advantage of that, there's a good chance it will succeed if it's done properly. So whether rightly or wrongly, Richard was perceived as being very close to Alex Salmond, and Murray Foote, via his editorship of the Daily Record, was not, and therefore, and I'm questioning this, right, was Murray deemed to be more politically suitable, more temperamentally suitable? You know, could he be more trusted, given that there is a civil war raging inside the SNP at the moment, and there truly is. The civil war inside the SNP is potentially more problematic and has already taken up more hours and more energy inside the SNP than fighting the Tories, fighting the Labour Party. That's the political battle at the moment, which says all you need to know about the weakness of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. So
yeah, the SNP can fight their own internal war at the same time as they're fighting every other opposition party, and they're still miles ahead in the polls.
Yeah, it's like if Celtic decided to play a B team in the Premiership, there's a good chance, you know, of what I'm saying here, but you know, that Celtic B team could end up being second or third. So Celtic are playing their most important games of the season are going to be against their own B team. And this is what it's like in Scottish politics at the moment. The SNP, the two sides in the SNP are the two most powerful forces in Scottish politics. The Labour Party and the Conservative Party are nowhere. I mean, George Kerrivan, your guest recently, wrote a piece for The National, was it last week or the week before, suggesting that if Alex Salmond were to stand and were to form a new independence party at the next election, there's a good chance that the Alex Salmond party would be the main opposition to Nicola Sturgeon, the SNP, and this also this was mentioned as well in the website that everybody hates Wings Over Scotland. I think last year, was it not, or was it earlier this year? That if that party under the tutelage of Alex Salmond were to be created, there's a very good chance that it would be the official opposition, which is nuts. You know, that's what does that say about democracy? What does that say about holding power to account? And what does it say about the Labour Party and the Conservative Party? You know, can they not find a leader? Can they not find, you know, something creative, something original? Can they just get a measure of charisma somewhere to connect with voters in their heartlands? Well, they appear not to have been able to. I mean, I'm talking about Tory heartlands, right? There aren't Tory heartlands in Scotland, but you know what I mean. But the Labour Party have said nothing new about anything in the last 10 years. And we're in the verge of this, where we've got the government of Scotland and the people who are causing it most problems are within the same party. Mm-hmm. And everyone's getting obsessed with GRA and hate crime. I mean, those are just, they mean nothing to people in working class or impoverished communities. They're indulgences, but they're being indulged because there's this sense of boredom within the party. Nobody's, there's no opposition, so they can get away with these kind of conceits, these indulgences that mean nothing to the vast majority of people, but it's a scratch that certain people, a certain sect in the party, feel they need to. It's an itch that these people feel they need to scratch.
Can I ask about this, because I have sort of read you in some of your columns in the last couple of years, sort of almost argue as far, and I don't know if this is your view, but you do see this argument around, and I think you've sometimes come close to articulating a version of this at least, that there's almost a sense in which the reason that we're not moving towards independence, at least not with any obvious coherent strategy that anyone can understand. I mean, the party's independent strategy is drifting. I'm actually quite pessimistic about it in general, but almost the reason that we're not making that approach towards independence is because of an obsession with what you've just called sort of these marginal issues that don't appeal to kind of a wide constituency in Scotland. I mean, my feeling about that is that that's misleading as to why we're not approaching independence. I mean, we know now how much, say, Nicola Sturgeon cares about the GRA reform. At the slightest sign of opposition, she punted it into the long grass, like she does every issue that comes up inside the party. I don't think that there is a strong lobby inside the Labour Party on questions of, I suppose you might call them social liberalism or something like that, and the hate crime bill might be another one. Like, I don't think that this faction that you're describing is particularly committed to anything. I think that they sometimes view these questions as kind of easy wins, right? So we've gone through a period in history where for about the last 30 years, centre-left administrations have made waves on very few issues, except advances in things like equal marriage, abortion rights, questions of this kind. In the British context, partly because of the European Union, there's been a diminishment in kind of anti-immigration politics and anti-immigration sentiment, at least until very recent years. But you hear phrases like the trans lobby, for example. Well, the really powerful lobby inside the Scottish National Party is not for social liberalism. The really powerful lobby inside the Scottish National Party is by bankers and corporate CEOs. That's the powerful lobby. And if there's a lobby that's getting in the way of Scottish independence, surely it's that. Surely it's that the SNP is trying to attach independent strategy to powerful institutions that ultimately are deeply ambivalent about independence or even hostile.
Can I just say, I mean,
Sorry, carry on.
I don't think that it's a kind of, I don't disagree with that, David, right? But I think that it's undeniable that in the advanced capitalist economies everywhere, that there has been the use of social liberalism by these lobbies in order to pursue their economic project whilst window dressing on those types of gains. I mean, that would be my presentation of woke washing, which is my new sort of buzzword. But I don't think that the SNP is any exception to that. So the way that I'm trying to think about, like, you know, how the hate crime legislation and the debate around the GRA is playing out with this particular project that Nicola Sturgeon has with her closest advisors, you know, people like Andrew Wilson and Angus Robertson.
Benny Higgins.
Is that who are they trying to appeal to? So in all those New Labour-esque focus groups that, like, I have in my head, like from the thick of it, you know, what is the caricature of the individual that they are trying to win to their program? And for me, I can't get the idea of like the kind of the Edinburgh academic lawyer type, right? This is actually who they are trying to win. Like, this is their project is to win that part of the Scottish bourgeoisie to independence, to create a cross-class alliance. And what's happening is that in doing that, alongside the pressures from the lobby that you outline, is causing a lot of the focus to be on these areas of identity politics, which suits the realpolitik of Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP like leadership. But also because we live in a current climate of cancel culture, which is real, you know, that there's like, if you do have a view on like the hate crime stuff is a better example than the GRA, because that's a lot of that is just right. Bad faith, right? And everybody in it, like, you know, wants to say something about it, and like quite a lot of it is in bad faith. Not all of it's in bad faith. But like what I'm saying, I suppose, is like the all of these interests, all of these lobbies, like they have a relationship with one another, and like that's partly why I think the SNP is taking this direction. Because David, you're totally right. Like, you know, the slightest bit of opposition to something like the GRA and it gets shelved. And this is not it doesn't come from a genuine drive to change society or improve conditions for people. It comes from politicking and trying to, you know, win, to create this cross-class alliance on the question of independence. That would be my view.
I think each of you are I'm not, this might sound condescending, but each of you are on the right track here, and especially the narrative about business, about the SNP seeking to win over business, to the extent that business now have a much greater influence than the woke brigade. And you're right, I have discussed that in 2 or 3 columns. However, let me suggest something else. When Alex Salmond was the leader of the party, he was probably the first modern SNP leader to actively reach out to business and to try and convince business that an independent Scotland wasn't a threat to them, that the SNP weren't a threat to them, that they weren't a left-wing party, that they were happy to work with business. And Alex Salmond knew the current, he knew the vocabulary, he knew the lexicon inside out, because he was a former economist with the RBS, and his wife was an even more senior economist in RBS. So and he went to St Andrews University. So he spoke the language and he knew the people, and he made some headway. Now, I would suggest that there are serious business figures in Scotland at the moment who are who for the last year or so, maybe before, are getting ready for an independent Scotland, and they're putting down their claims, similar to in the manner of the gold rush. They might not agree with it. Of course, they'll think it's risky, but they can't afford not to take it seriously, and therefore they're putting claims down. Because just as they've done well out of the UK, and they feel that the UK offers the best security for their business interests, their attitude is, but if we have to be independent, we need to make sure that that we've got the same influence in an independent Scotland. I wouldn't underestimate the influence of these fringe kind of culty groups. It doesn't suggest that Nicola Sturgeon, may be emotionally invested in these. I just think that because the SNP have been in power for so long, and because at this point in time it looks like they're set fair for another 10 years or so. So if you want to advance a cause, or you want to seek influence for your cause, you seek to infiltrate the party of government, isn't it? It's a waste of time getting involved in the Tories, Labour, Lib Dems, the Greens. and they have, and you're right, I mean, there aren't all that many of them, but stealthily they have gained a degree of control of the NEC. Now, a few weeks ago I wrote about the NEC, the National Executive Committee of the SNP, because of the way that it stitched up Joanna Cherry. I spoke to, I would have said almost up to 10 SNP people at various levels, and I asked them to tell me how many people were on their own NEC. 2 of them were on the NEC. None of them knew for definite how many people were on the NEC. Maybe 40, maybe 39, maybe 42. Didn't know. But what they did know is that over the last few years, there are groups, the three of us could basically phone up 2 of our pals who kind of broadly agree with, right, let's say we agree with the principles of those women in that poster behind you, Kat, right, and we want to set up something in the West End representing their interests, and there's 10 of us, and we've got a bit of poppy to throw about, right, and we know 1 or 2 people who sponsor us in the party, right? Of course there's 1 or 2 people. That's you. You've probably negotiated the first 5 steps for getting a seat in the NEC. Whereas more maybe traditional, I hesitate to say old-fashioned, but maybe more working class, more traditional politicians who want to knock doors, go to meetings, hand out pamphlets, make speeches, gain support, the old way of, rising within a party. They've been doing their bit, knocking the doors, getting the code in Port Glasgow and Postle Park, whereas these 10 people have set up a group representing the interests of, I don't know, call it what you will, and hey presto, they've got a seat in the NEC, and there's 41 of them. Why does any party's National Executive Committee in a population of 5 million need a 41-member National Executive Committee? Anyway, that kind of infrastructure is ripe for infiltration. Might be too strong a word, but it is ripe to be influenced if you're committed, if you tunnel vision, this is what I want. It can be done by stealth. It can be done in such a way, because everybody's eyes off the ball. There's Brexit, there's the ongoing constitutional question, there's the Alex Salmond trial. So when those big issues happen, you can just slide in there. And I think that some people are using what you might want to call, what was it you called it, the woke wash. I'm not even sure they're woke. I think a lot of them are fake woke, but they know that it's an issue that will get traction at certain parts of the SNP, and it could be fast-tracked into the National Executive Committee of the Government of Scotland, continuing power seduces, and that's causing a lot of angst within the party. People who are not necessarily anti-transgender, people who don't have a bigoted bone in their body, but they resent that this burrowing out of the party, which they're aware of, but they can't put their finger on it, and they're wondering why it's been allowed to happen, and they're wondering why, you know, certain groups seem to have more influence, or to have gained more influence in a very short space of time than them and their friends who have been working for the SNP, man and boy, woman and girl, for 40 years. And they're still kind of, they'll be lucky if they get a wee handshake with Nicola at the party conference.
See, if you're arguing that, like, you know, like equalities positions, for example, can be used as a kind of ladder of influence and so on, and as we are discussing, you know, you can abuse that politics in that way. You can use it as a ladder, but so can the backlash against it.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Alan Smith, for example, right? He was once seen as kind of, you know, the kind of caliph of Boko Haram, right? He was a sort of hate figure for these kinds of arguments inside the SNP.
I want you to edit that out so that I can use it in a column.
But he, you know, all of a sudden, one day, you know, he something he said was leaked about we need to move away from all this equalities agenda and back towards independence. And hey presto, a couple of days after it was leaked, he then recapitulated that leak as an article in the National, right? So you have a situation like this is the worry of me with this kind of stuff, is there are huge structural questions around independence, but they are being obscured by the cynical abuse, let's say, of these questions. And secondarily, and I do think this is sad, it's destroying the capacity of the movement or anyone to have a sound, reasoned conversation about the issues engendered by you know, demands for on an equalities basis or whatever. I mean, now, obviously, that's not just the responsibility of the SNP or the independence movement or whatever. Arguments like the GRA reform argument were shredded on social media. I mean, there was next to nothing but poisonous arguments around that issue and many others, and it's become quite a kind of degraded atmosphere. But I just feel that what we've seen in the last few months, in particular, is, you know, quite a cynical. People using it as these issues as launch pads in various directions. I mean, Alan Smith is about the most unrealistic personality to be the Mr. Independence. You know, the guy who says, you know, well, I care about equalities, but fuck them because I'm big, you know, I'm Mr. Independence and I'm going for Scottish independence and all in this shite get in the way. I mean, it was quite a turnaround.
Yeah, yeah.
Kevin, the phrase that you could use is you could go for wokest day. I think that's more on brand for you.
I got a phone call from my daughter in Australia a couple of days ago, who's like a woke princess. Both her and my other daughter are both woke princesses. And I love them. I love the fact that they're right into their politics, and I at least gave them that. But anytime she phones from Australia, I know that I'm I know I'm in for a kicking, because you know, they keep an eye on stuff that I retweet. And so Claire in Australia sent me a link to what she called a more balanced and realistic discussion on all aspects of gender reform. Much more balanced and reasonable and less cynical than you, Dad. I really recommend that you listen to it. And I want you to listen to it. And I'm going to phone you next week to see if you have. So that, you know, that was me tell. And it actually was quite reasonable. So I said to Claire, I'm just not going to write about GRE again, because like I can't win and I don't have the language skills for it. I don't know my way around the lexicon, and I get into trouble and stick the size 10s into it. And I think I'm being reasonable and you know, inclusive and diverse, and you know, end up fucking myself, you know. So I'm leaving it.
I can't believe you used the phrase woke princess on our podcast. I think that's probably one of my favourite moments so far.
About your own daughter, no less, yeah.
I know.
You know what I mean? At least your daughter had the courtesy not to have a go at you on Twitter about it.
Oh God, she scalped me badly. But that's what happens when you try to politicize your daughters at an early age. They end up getting a mind of their own.
I wanted to so David, you mentioned one of our favourite politicians already, Alan Smith.
Can you excuse me a second? I'm going to have a cigarette. Can I have a cigarette?
Of course.
It's not right. 2 seconds.
There's something important to be said here about the current SNP leadership and their approach to class and the current class composition of SNP MSPs. So in the article that George Kerrivan wrote recently for the Conter website, he talked about how a quarter of SNP MSPs come from the management consultancy industry, which I always think is like it's a very new Labour thing. Then and there's another quarter that's made up of like the classic middle class, lawyers, journalists, teachers, medical staff. I mean, and Kevin, you've written a couple of articles about the SNP's attitude towards the working class more generally. So I mean, what I'm trying to navigate through here, and I don't really have answers for it, but my instinct tells me that there is a bit of an anti-working class feel to the way that the SNP are approaching politics right now, because they are trying to appeal to this stereotype of the Edinburgh academic and win them to the SNP's sensible programme compared to Boris Johnson, blah, 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 and trying to win people to that. But what that has done is it's created a kind of like anti-working class feeling to their politics, to their political approach, and so on and so forth. And I think that that's really clearly typified by the attitude towards the independence movement. It's specifically all under one banner. There's a kind of like almost like a sneering and distaste for the mass movement of the stuff that's organized by all under one banner, because it does, I mean, it looks quite messy, and I feel like there's a sort of sneeringness from the SNP in a lot of quarters to the kind of the demos and the flags and it looks messy. And I think that is real. I think that there is a real kind of idea of anti-working class prejudice, and that somehow they need to better themselves. And when people don't know the language of how to discuss topics around identity politics, then these people are shunned and they're called bigots, or they're like discarded to the side, and they're not useful to the political project. However, the danger with that and the left's response to that is it can't become a kind of anti-intellectual response to it. So I don't think that by just saying, oh, these are all like middle class arseholes that are trying to like drag us into debates about identity politics, fuck them, all we care about is jobs, right? Like, I think that, and there are people who are saying that, and there are people who typify that view. I don't want to name names, but there are people who typify that view. What it does is it just creates an anti-intellectualism on the left. And to be frank, like, what Scotland doesn't need is an anti-intellectual left. And we've had that for quite some time, and it's gotten us nowhere. Like, we actually need a way to engage people, like engage working class people on the issues that matter, but also not be afraid to challenge people on things like particularly on imperialism, Trident, NATO. These kind of ideas I think are really important. So I'm trying to like navigate a way through this that's like, well, there are elements of truth on both sides of this. But I mean, someone like Chris McElhenney, who I think is a really interesting politician, like when he, and I think he's got interesting things to say, and he is working class, and you know, he is of the party's left, but when he talks about things like less time should be spent appeasing trans ideology, like to me that just goes back into the echo chamber. Do you know what I mean? And it just keeps this culture war perpetuating itself. And actually that's kind of how we've ended up in the situation that we're in.
I think to start with Chris McElhenney, I think you have to bear in mind that he's the leader of the SNP group at Inverclyde Council. And Inverclyde, almost from the outset of the coronavirus pandemic, was experiencing rates of infection and deaths that were, at one point, were running 3 times the national average. This built upon the fact that his ward, his part of Inverclyde, was ranked as the most deprived area in Scotland, and the patterns of disadvantage and poverty in Inverclyde are quite shocking in areas. And I suppose there's a certain amount of frustration that he feels he has to express that despite 20 years of continuous left to left of centre government in Scotland, devolved government in Scotland, despite 60 odd years of continuous left-wing government, including the previous constitutional arrangement, the same places that were afflicted with poverty and deprivation post-war, pre-war, going back to Victorian times, are the same places that are experiencing it now. And nothing has happened. All the left-wing governments, all the people who say they're socialist, all the agendas, the left-wing agendas that various administrations have had in Scotland, we've had in Scotland 60 years, have done nothing. Nothing that they have attempted has worked in these areas. So there is a frustration there. I'm not sure that I would say that. I wouldn't say that the SNP are consciously anti-working class. I feel that there's almost like a suspicion of them, almost a fear of them. The SNP, and they're not alone in this, and this comes with continuous power. They become very controlling because, you know, if you're 10, 12, 15 years in power, you begin to know, you gain a certain expertise in how to use the levers of power, obviously to your advantage. So you can't help but become controlling. And the SNP are experts at control because they've been the controlling party in 15 years. They know the apparatus of government, they know how to oil it. But I think there's a kind of betrayal of some of their base instincts, such as the named person scheme, minimum alcohol pricing, the ridiculous the ridiculous campaign to ban the buckie in Scotland in some of our edgier neighbourhoods, and it kind of spoke to me of you know, they know they need the working class. They have to have messages that will engage the working class. It was the only 4 areas that voted by a majority for independence in 2014 were largely working class areas. So they need, you know, they need the working class. But it's almost like, you know, I don't want to travel in public. I love the public. I like to travel in public transport. It's just the public. They're just not, you know, they'll represent the public. They'll represent poor people because, you know, they need to. But it doesn't mean that they have to actually get amongst them and understand them. You know, Darren McGarvey, aka Lockie, his book addressed issues like that. It's all very well coming into the housing estates with your clipboards and your suits and with a good heart. But all that you prescribe and the numbers that you crunch are meaningless unless you actually speak to the people who are affected most by these issues, and bring them into the decision-making process. I don't think the SNP are very good at that. And I think that there is a kind of residual, primordial fear of people who speak with authentic working class accents, who don't have a degree, who work in what we used to know as the trades, because they maybe don't get the picture, they don't get the new messages that we're trying to convey, they don't get modernism. But also there's another thing. I've been writing about this for a few years, and I've got nothing to back it up. But precisely because the SNP have, I mean, how long have they been in government? 2007, so 13 years, 14 years by Holyrood. They'll win Holyrood, that's 18 years. They'll probably win the next one, it's 22 years. You know, you can build up a massive pension pot. You can build a long career within the SNP as a professional, you know, as an advisor, various groups of advisors. And if you're a minister, or you get to become a minister or a junior minister, or you get a safe seat, you become a kind of recognizable figure in the country. You become somebody, not somebody who's just there for a few years. This is part of the ongoing, eternal, endless, you know, party of government. And at a very human level, that's very enticing and very seductive. I'd be seduced by it. You know, you get married, you have a couple of kids, and you want to buy a nice house, and well, I don't want to rock the boat. I've got a nice income here. I've got influence. I open places. People recognise me in the street. I go onto the television sometimes. There will be businesses who will hire me because of my network gained over many years in the party of government. Why do I want to threaten that? Now, I'm not saying that they're secretly against independence. I just think that your enthusiasm for that project would wane. It would be like, this is a nice life. We're devolved. We've got 60%, 55, 60% control of the running of the country, which is 55, 60% more than we had 20 years ago. Because if Scotland does become independent, the first thing that will happen after independence is, well, there's going to have to be a general election to elect the government. Now, if the Labour Party ever got its act together and it elected a charismatic leader with a suite of engaging policies and hard-working politicians, you know, there's a decent chance that that Labour could form the first post-independent Scottish government. And where's your SNP then? Where's the, you know, suddenly your career in the SNP, which has been golden and continually upwards, comes to a juddering halt when you're 10 years short. You're 10 years short of the holiday home in the West Coast or the timeshare in Spain. And it's like, you know, maybe it's like St. Augustine in Catholicism. Lord, change me, but not quite yet. And in the SNP, it's almost like, yeah, I want independence, but not quite yet. Not until I've made my pile, not until I've got the second house, not until I've embellished my CV so shinily that I can walk into any one number of half a dozen boardrooms. I know that's cynical, but if you've got any kind of knowledge of how humanity works, and I'm saying this because I'd be subject to these forces as well as a human being. You know, it's something to consider, and I think there's a disproportionate number of people of that mindset, that careerism, people who are maybe not on a mission. You know, politics, they want to make a difference, but they're not going to get their hands dirty too much. And I think there's a possibility that explains a kind of apparent lack of enthusiasm for finding new routes to press home, well, 58% advantage. It's all very well having 58% support, but Boris Johnson just needs to say "niet," as he's entitled to do. And in fact, people keep saying to me, look at that, 58% record support for independence. If I was Boris Johnson, that would make me even more determined to say, no, you're not having your referendum because you might win it. So there, where is the plan B, the plan C? And the apparent lack of it suggests there's just, you know, maybe there's no enthusiasm. Maybe it's just let's continue in this comfortable vein for a little while. It'll sort itself out, and meanwhile, you know, I can get my deposit together for Sky. Is that cynical? Is that really cynical?
I think that there's a lot in that, in terms of like both Boris Johnson and Nicola Sturgeon have a lot to gain by just by continuing the current situation. Boris Johnson looks tough and he looks committed to the union by saying no. And of course, the Tory vote in Scotland is based entirely on him saying no. I mean, it's there for almost nothing else. If he were to say yes to an independence referendum, Scottish Toryism would die overnight. It would be a catastrophe. Nicola Sturgeon's not being harmed, and the SNP party hierarchy is not being harmed by Tories saying no to them. The Tories have already said no twice, and it hasn't hurt Nicola Sturgeon's project. And on the contrary, if the polls hold up the way they are now, the SNP is going to deliver its, and this is a big if, but the SNP would deliver its largest majority, could deliver a majority government in the next elections.
They're talking about 70 odd.
Yeah. And then, of course, a lot could happen between now and the election. But still, it shows that it's not, Tory intransigence is not undermining the current trajectory, the kind of ultra-gradualist political tendency inside the SNP. And I think it becomes a bit like what socialism is for the Labour Party. The Labour Party has been preaching the socialist future for over 100 years, but it stops being a realisable project and it sort of becomes an organising principle for the party. Everyone psychologically is, on some level, I'm sure, what's his name, Keir Starmer, this is the kind of way I think about it, I'm sure he wants Britain to be a more egalitarian place. But for him, as the German socialist Eduard Bernstein said, the journey is everything. The movement is everything, the destination is nothing. It becomes more about the process than about actually achieving the end state that you want. I feel like because you raised a bit of theology there, that we should steer you towards God.
When did I talk about theology?
It was it St. Paul?
St. Augustine.
St. Augustine.
Yeah. It was an ecumenical saint. Because
that would be
Catholics
an ecumenical matter. Yeah.
Catholic, yeah, that would be an Catholics and Protestants both think he was a cat's whiskers.
Aye. So you, before we came on, you were saying that someone writes letters into the National complaining about all your God bothering, and that you'd gone back across your articles and found that you'd only mentioned God twice. Do you often think that this is one of the most astonishing stories of Scotland in the last 50 or 60 years? At the end of the Second World War, Scotland, I think church attendance in the Kirk in Scotland was among the highest church attendances in Europe. Here we are in the early decades of the next century. Scotland is one of the most secular countries, one of the most atheistic countries on the earth. What is that? What's your... What do you think the position of the religious is in Scottish society today?
I think some of the most profound, most enlightened ideas governing politics, left-wing politics especially right now, have their sources in Christian belief, Christian theology. A few weeks ago, I was discussing this in the Herald, and I mentioned John Knox, the great Protestant reformer, and how, yeah, I think the point I was trying to make was that you can't dismiss. Look, it is a secular state. There should be separation of church and state. You don't want in the words of Ian Paisley, a priest-ridden banana republic like the Republic of Ireland, right? We don't want that, okay? And I say that as a Catholic. But a lot of the ideas that we would call progressive and enlightened have their source in Christian thinking. So yeah, John Knox, I mentioned that as far back as the 16th century, John Knox wanted a school in every parish. He wanted free university education. He wanted education for the poorest in the land. And the fact that 200 odd years later, one of the best biographers of Robert Burns was writing and I think it was in 1880, was moved to comment that even in the poorest and the most deprived areas in Victorian Scotland, and they were poor and deprived indeed, the level of literacy amongst the children in these areas was astonishingly high, and it's simply because John Knox's vision of free education for all, basically as a human right, had worked. And despite the following attendances, like you have the Catholic Church has got notionally about 750,000 members, but only maybe 200,000. So more or less a quarter, slightly more than a quarter, actually go to church. But that's still 200,000. And there are still several 100,000 others who will identify as Catholic or who would admit to being influenced by Catholic thought, Catholic teaching. I would assume that there are similar numbers in the Reformed traditions, Church of Scotland, Free Church of Scotland, Methodist, Baptist, and on the left, and it's a continuous dilemma on the left. So I'm Catholic, Christian, and left wing. So my faith informs my politics. I wouldn't have been left wing, or I wouldn't have engaged in left wing politics or gravitated towards them if it hadn't been for my faith. But equally, my politics and the people that I've met in politics and secular politics has also helped shape the nature of my faith. So there are bridges being built all the time. You know, if you look at It's like the kind of the ribbons in a DNA just curling up around each other, faith and secular politics. And for me, it's worked. But I don't think I'm alone. I think that there are hundreds of thousands of Scots who either attend church or who don't, but are still influenced by what they learned as children, what they learned from their parents, what they learned at school. And it has informed politics, and politics has informed their faith. And I think that's a good, mature, reasonable balance. And I think that it's at the heart of Scottish society, almost unspoken, unwritten, but it's there. And we don't have to be overt about it. We don't have to be, evangelical about it. But that balance has been an important dynamic in Scottish life. And I suppose when I've written about this recently, my fear is that the balance is being, it's tipping too much in one direction. That there are, I saw today when McElhenney had announced that he'd been past fit to stand on his Twitter feed. There are, amongst the messages of support, there were others saying, yeah, but you're a Catholic, and so that means that you're anti-abortion, therefore we can't have you in government. We've already got, we've had, can't remember SNP politician's name, who is who's an elder in the Church of Scotland, was threatened with deselection because she voted against the party whip to impose abortion on Northern Ireland at the time when the government was down there. And she said, well, I couldn't do anything else because I'm a Christian and she'd suffered several miscarriages, and this was her voting with her conscience. But she wasn't seeking to impose those views on the party, on the public. It's basically her conscience. It's what she believes in spiritually, emotionally. But I see there are people in the SNP and in other parties in Holyrood. We're getting to a stage where even just to have that conscience, even though you're not wanting to alter the status quo, but by having that conscience and having your thoughts formed by that, should debar you from public office, because we just don't like the look of your beliefs. We like some beliefs, we'll live with some beliefs, but we're not living with them because it just doesn't look right. There's a bad smell about it. That's all. I'm not promoting a Christian state. I'm not promoting anything. I'm not promoting disproportionate Christian influence. All I'm saying is that the balance has been good for Scotland, and there are some people who now want to upset the balance for no good reason. I can't say any good reason other than I don't fancy it. I don't trust it. It's not a good look. We'd rather not have it. So we'd rather you just went away, hid, concealed yourself. We cancelled you. I think that's roughly my position.
It's though it's often not thought of as this, it's a peculiarly kind of Northern Western European issue, because I think atheists that you meet, for example, in Britain, seem to think that religion is collapsing all over the world, and it isn't. I mean, you're talking there about John Knox. I mean, no, not John Knox. Sorry, was it Martin Luther? But in either case, these were also people who heralded the decline of religion in Northern and Western Europe. So basically, the parts of Europe where Protestantism flourished are the most secular parts of the earth today. The only exception is the famous exception in the United States, where Protestantism created, colonial and post-colonial societies, one of the most religious on the earth. I think it ranks just below Iran and Pakistan. So people forget that religion is still this extremely powerful force on a global level. just not really in the small corner of the globe that we inhabit.
I think you're right. I think you're right. In fact, you could probably say that some of the principal motivating factors of Protestantism, hard work, honest toil, and looking after your family, being a good citizen, accepting the rule of law, could, over a couple of hundred years, probably help deliver the secular state. Making money, corporatism, all rest on these original pillars of white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. Work hard, make some money, get ahead, own things, be suspicious of people who want something for nothing, which were all solid enough and helped lift communities at the time, 16th, 17th, 18th century. They helped lift communities or lift their gaze into something else. But you could also argue that it presaged what we now know as globalism, corporatism. You know, work hard, don't seek a loan, don't get into debt. Except when, as you probably know, if it's far harder to get a small loan from a bank than a large loan. You know, you walk into a bank with a couple of people behind you and say, I want 10 million quid. They'll take you seriously. If you say I want $5,000 to get a new motor,
yeah,
you piss off.
I hope you realise, Kevin, that you've stolen my mantle here as the Presbyterian bigot, because you've described Ireland as a priest-ridden banana republic, and Protestantism as the bringer of family values and hard work.
I mean, it's a real plot twist, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, since you bring up the topic of abortion, right? I have a very clear view on that. You know, I've always been very much in the pro-choice camp. I've written on it extensively. But I think over the last few years, I have started to be more vocal in terms of, like, I don't actually think that this is a red line issue. Like, I think we have to have a left that's big enough to encapsulate people who are anti-abortion, because regardless of whether or not I wish it existed or not, there is a left-wing case for the pro-life lobby, but it is dominated by the worst of the fundamentalist right in like the whole varied Christian organizations. Do you know what I mean? It's dominated by the kind of right wing. Yeah, and some of their tactics are incredibly questionable. However, it's undeniable that there are still statistics that show that the number one reason that women are choosing to have an abortion is because of economic circumstances. This is where I start to get quite pissed off with the question of conscience, especially when there are politicians who have destroyed communities, destroyed people's livelihoods, contributed to drug deaths, alienation, and poverty on such a massive generational scale, are choosing to vote with their conscience on a question of abortion, when actually it's the economic conditions that they choose to perpetuate that is forcing women into a situation where they feel they can't afford to have a child. Well, that in itself is an incredibly sick situation to be in.
I agree. It's quite ironic. You kind of find yourself, Kat, moving in one direction, which is kind of like seeking to accommodate pro-life views within the left, and I have I've travelled a little bit in the other direction, from being, you know, very pro-life, feeling that the unborn child has as much right to human rights as those outside the womb, adults, children. They're all human, and and I've always kind of promulgated the human rights, like the most fragile human beings, the ones most need of our protection are unborn children, rather than the traditional Christian ethos behind that. But I remember several years ago, some of the more kind of fundamental evangelical people and groups within the Catholic Church and in other churches began this torchlight vigil outside the Queen Elizabeth Hospital to witness against people going in to have an abortion. And I thought this was cruel, because I remember thinking, if only they would expend as much energy trying to address the causes that make these women, force these women into that choice, than they actually do about trying to stop abortions. You know, do they really care about the economic circumstances that many of that drove many of these women to this position? And in an awful lot of cases, no. You know, if one of these women were to turn around and say, you know what, I'm not going to have the abortion, but I've got no money. My family's thrown me out. Father doesn't want to know. What are you going to do about it? Somebody going to take me into your home tonight? You're going to look after me? Going to help me look after my child or provide economically for it? And they won't. And it's the kind of preachy, it's the preachy aspect of it, and the you know, the condemnation and the judgmentalism, and it's a real dilemma for me. It goes back to, like, you know, my kind of socialism and Christianity informing each other, but over that one issue of abortion, that's the massive dilemma. On one hand, I do believe that it's that an unborn child is fully human, but on the other hand, I can't even begin to imagine the terrors and the uncertainty and the poverty, the disadvantage, the cruelty, the violence that might have brought that woman to that position. And who am I to condemn, judge, make value judgments? You know, I've got no right here at all. But that puts me outside of traditional Catholic thinking, but it also, you know, probably puts me outside of traditional leftist thinking.
Yeah, I mean, and this is where I think it gets interesting, is that my view on this is that basically just that the left has to be big enough to be able to, like, accommodate those, like, different views on those questions. I've always been, if I'm being honest, like, I've always been slightly suspicious of the aggressively secular left. I mean, I am culturally Catholic, I guess. Like, I've not been to church for a long, long time, but I do think that my politics have probably been informed by my faith at quite an early age. And I do believe in God, and I'm very much on the pro-God left. And that's partly to do with...
Is that a thing? And I'm genuine about this. Is there a kind of...
Just on this podcast.
Yeah, just on this podcast. I mean,
actually, that could be... If we get 10 other people who are on the pro-God left, we could get a seat in the NEC.
Let's go for it. I mean, the other thing, like, to bring this back to the SNP, like, this is part of my frustration with them, is, like, I think that you're right about this stuff around, like, the working class. Like, they're not overtly anti-working class, but there is a suspicion there. But the thing that pisses me off most of all is that there is a sense that the working class is stitched up for the SNP and for independence, and there's a real, like, taken for granted with the working class vote.
Which is the trap, of course, of the Labour Party.
It's the same with the Catholic vote. I think that there's a sense that the SNP think they've got the Catholic vote all stitched up, because that was obviously a project of Salmond as well. Like, Salmond, you know, actively courting the Catholic community in Scotland to bring them into the fold, his relationship with like Catholic leaders, you know, and really working on those relationships there. But I mean, more generally, in terms of my pro-God leftism, which I'm sure other people are deeply suspicious of, but like part of it is a bit of a romantic notion about like when the left was strong. So going back to the 20s and 30s, when we had like well-organized, strong left, strong trade unions, and I think about like my own family's interaction with that, is that on a day-to-day basis, as like Irish Catholic communities, like living in an Irish Catholic community, having emigrated from Ireland to Scotland, that it builds a sense of community cohesion. But there is also every single day part of a ritual or a practice which asks people to set aside their own individual desires, their own individual wants and fears, and what they think is right. They set that aside to achieve a common goal, or
collectivism.
to worship around a common goal. And I think psychologically that's a really important thing. And I think that the left right now suffers from not only its own structural weakness, but a loss of the concept of God, which essentially deflates our own egos. So if we're living in a society where, like, you know, I mean, probably 90% of Europe is mentally ill, like, you know, we have huge amounts of alienation, you know, we're all interested in like what our own individual points of view are and pushing them forward. And we don't really have a mechanism in society by which we can say, do you know what? See what Kat thinks today, it's just not important because I'm going to set that aside in order to pursue this common goal with these other people. Like, and I think that we do really, I really lament the loss of religion for being able to serve that purpose, which, I mean, I suppose it seems like quite a cold analysis of why religion matters. But I also think that having an aggressively secular left can lead to like really poor policy positions on particular topics and really bad analysis. So the certain sections of the left that basically wouldn't touch the question of Islamophobia with a barge pole for years. Do you know what I mean? Actually saw Islam as barbaric, as backwards, as like anti-women, like without actually understanding its purpose for people primarily, but also its part in an anti-imperialist struggle, like particularly for women who, you know, have chosen to reject American cultural norms by, you know, donning religious dress, you know, and that is a real thing. And I think that the secular left, or the aggressively secular left, really lost their bearings on this due to what is essentially a prejudice or a lack of humility or a lack of understanding. So I was quite lucky in the, you know, my left tradition did take these questions quite seriously and understood the role of particularly Islam in an anti-imperialist setting. There was something else I was going to moan about there, but I can't remember what it is.
What do you, David? What do you think? What's your background? Where are you coming from?
I'm not religious at all. In fact, I'm probably one of the most materialist, I mean, philosophically, people I've ever met, which isn't by choice. I mean, the thing that I find strange about that is, I mean, basically, I'm an atheist because my parents were atheists. In fact, I actually remember believing in God before I found out my parents were atheists. And the moment they told me, I changed my mind. So I've always got that lingering question of, you know, well, am I more enlightened? Or am I just the same way as people with religious parents grow up religious? I grew up with different, because you automatically agree with your parents, right? But I'm philosophically totally like atheist. But I agree with the general. So there's a really, I mean, when I was kind of coming of age politically, there were two really, really stupid political tendencies, intellectual tendencies, on what you might have then called the left, though interestingly, a lot of those people have since moved very far to the right. One was so-called militant atheism, which was one of the most degraded intellectual currents, you know, in modern history. and another was Islamophobia. Now, I remember at the time of the huge anti-war demonstrations and all that kind of stuff, before I was really articulate in politics, before I'd come into contact with people who talked to me about politics, like I grew up in there wasn't a lot of like socialists and stuff around, but I did think all that stuff about Muslims. Like when I was a teenager, I hated the wars, I hated the war in Afghanistan and Iraq and all that kind of stuff. But I did think all that stuff about like, yeah, but the Muslims, they are, you know, quite sexist and homophobic, and they've got all these kind of scary ideas and stuff like that. So that was a powerful thing. And if you were on the left and you didn't think very much about politics, you didn't talk to many people about politics, it would be your default stance that the Muslims, though, were a bit creepy and, you know, so on. And it took a real effort on the British left. One of the things that has been done right in few things, you might say, that has been done really well on the left in Britain was in stamping that out during the anti-war movement and saying, no, you know, even a phenomenon like political Islamism, which obviously has its ultra-violent side and, you know, and its extreme fringes and so on, you have to understand it materially. You have to understand that this is an ideology which has emerged from the destruction that's been done in Muslim countries and stuff like that. And I also remember an argument being made to me against that kind of secularist liberal ethos in general was our struggle for free speech in Britain emerged first out of the demand for religious expression. So we fought a war in Britain, you know, in the English Civil War, was partly, in large part, fought for the rights of dissenting religious groups to speak, to organise, to worship as they saw fit. So it's a completely ahistoric attitude that you have religion on one side as the enemy of freedom, and then atheism on the other is as the force of good and reason and rationalism. There's nothing rational about the perspectives of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. That's irrationalism. That's anti-enlightenment. That's darkness. Like if you are willing to promote wars as Christopher Hitchens did on the basis that people believe in God, rather than coming to a materialist conception, if that is your philosophy, a materialist understanding of why 80% of people in the world still believe in God, right? That to me, if you're an atheist, is a fascinating question. It's not one that's just like, oh, aren't people dumb, which is the sort of thing that you hear. Christopher Hitchens' famous claim about why 80% of people believed in God was that they had, you know, underdeveloped mammalian brains. But it does make you think, well, what are you saying? You're saying that in the northwest of Europe, our brains are more developed? What are you saying? We're more evolved and that's why we're not as religious anymore? It's totally stupid. Ultimately, the militant atheists they didn't believe in social science. They didn't believe that things could happen for sociological reasons or anthropological reasons. They only really believed that religious belief could be happening because of physical biology, which is actually an extremely reactionary attitude about the world. So, I mean, every so often that guy who plays Mr. Bean turns up on TV and complains about religion, right? He thinks he's Spinoza. There was a time when the left had to make a determined struggle against religious obscurantism and so on. And there probably are still parts of the world where it has to. I mean, Islamists regularly kill trade unionists in Pakistan, right? I'm talking about my own national context here. Modern liberal atheistic, militant atheism is not a progressive creed. It's a reactionary, pro-state, pro-system, pro-oppression creed. And that's what it was used for. It's no mistake, even the people like Richard Dawkins who say that they opposed the Iraq War and so on, it's no mistake that they rose to prominence in the way they did at the time of the so-called War on Terror. It was to create a left gloss for a campaign of aggression in Muslim countries. That's what it was about. Yeah. And so, yeah, in general, I mean, I am so glad that we're not in a position where, for example, some of the new women Muslim MPs who've been elected at Westminster, or someone like Ilhan Omar in America, is being cross-examined about exactly what they think about women's reproductive rights. Like, whatever I think about abortion rights and so on, I'm so glad that we created the basis where that wasn't happening, because it's destructive. Just to return to that particular point, but in a more general sense, yeah, like I do worry about the kind of exclusion of religious people from public life, because ultimately, who does it hurt? You know, it will be minority groups. You know, the militant atheists claim they were critiquing all religion at once, but ultimately their boots only landed on one or two small religious communities, and that's the way it's always gonna ride in a country like Britain anyway.
I think, ironically, there are lessons in that to be learnt by the traditional powerhouses of Western Christianity, the Catholic Church, the Church of Scotland, the Baptists, where up until the 70s, 80s, a kind of absolutism reigned, and it was tacked on to fear of hell, and it kind of preyed on ignorance, which is why this is a point I was making in this article a few weeks ago, that one of the main reasons, the driving forces of the Protestant Reformation, was to have the Bible written in the vernacular, and there was a reason why the power structures of Europe at that time allied with the Pope to stop that happening, because if the working classes found out the real nature of Jesus, you know, throwing the money changers out the temple, the widow's mite, the Good Samaritan, like socialism, they didn't want that to be happening, so we'll keep it in Latin, which nobody can, the punters can't understand that. We do, and we can just tell them the bits we want them to hear. And those ideas continued to inform organized Christianity, mainstream Christianity, until, you know, a divinity, a theologian might, or a historian might question this, but the emerging liberation theology in Latin America in the 70s, which successfully began to ally feelings of collectivism, socialism, and addressing inequality in a spiritual language, Christian context. And this scared the life out of the established church, that Jesus Christ would be seen as a kind of reforming, a reforming crusader who stood with the poor and always stood with the poor, and his message was primarily for the poor, and against power and against the accumulation of wealth, and it challenged a lot of power structures in the West who had supported the churches, not so much because they were particularly spiritual, but because they felt that the church could validate their gathering of wealth, their gathering of power, their invasion, which is what you're seeing. It's why at the moment Trump is reaching out not only to the Protestant evangelicals, but also to Catholics in America with this very almost medieval black and white interpretation of the Word of God, and he's bastardized it, but it's getting traction, and it's all because of this. It's all because of abortion. Like there are left-wing Catholics in America who don't like Trump. They'd really rather not like Trump, but there are priests and ministers saying you have to vote for him because he's anti-abortion, he's pro-life. Well, he's pro-life, so you know he wants to ban Muslims coming in. He wants to arm militia groups. He wants to encourage them to question the election if he loses it. He wants to target black people, or at least say to the police forces, you've nothing to fear from me if a bullet goes astray. Pro-life comes in various forms. It's not just anti-abortion. But at the moment, it's a dilemma for a lot of committed Christians in America. And we don't have that here. We've got a few bampots here, but we don't have it here because of this balance, quite fine balance between secularism and religion, which I think Scotland has handled quite well. I think there's room on the left. There is room for both because as Kat was saying, and my experience too, and the experience of a lot of my friends, our left wing thinking was started and then became informed by our faith, because our faith was nothing if it didn't stand against inequality, if it didn't stand for those who were without, because that essentially was the message of the Gospels, which we were told at school and church. And for that, and for being able to read that and to interpret it, we have the Protestant Reformation to be thankful for. And our tendency, our instinct towards free education, both free higher education, primary education, secondary education, also, as I was saying earlier, came from the Protestant Reformation. And it would just be a mistake of the left, as Kat was saying as well, to seek to alienate that and to despise it and to make it obsolete. I would hesitate to call it bigotry. I just think it's an arrogance like that. I remember that statement by Hitchens. I remember when I read it, I think that's possibly the most arrogant thing I've ever heard a human being say. To 80% of the world are basically mentally disturbed. Because they believe in God. I mean, fucking behave yourself.
So we've been recording for 2 hours.
You're joking?
No, I'm not.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's a good thing. I mean, it shows that we don't really have anything else to do with our time, though, right?
Well, we are going to start a group to join the NEC.
On a pro-God leftist platform.
Yeah, it's a kind of pro-God, kind of progressive atheist sort of, ecumenical platform.
Yeah, I guess we probably should stop recording now. But thank you very much, Kevin, for your time and your insights. I've really enjoyed it.
Oh, it was great. Thank you for inviting me.
I hope you enjoyed yourself. So, David, I never know how to end the podcast.
Yeah, so we're telling people to
money.
Turn off. Yeah, money. Did you say?
Yeah. We need money.
Yeah, send us all your money and what is it? What I'm saying, like, share, subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, subscribe on YouTube. If you're listening to it on whatever SoundCloud, then do subscribe there as well and help this podcast grow.
Okay, great.